There are parts of American history that were never written to be remembered, not because they didn't happen, but because the people who witnessed them made sure they disappeared. No records, no monuments, no official acknowledgement, just silence. And sometimes that silence tells you more than any document ever could. In 1864, during the final stretch of the Civil War, Union soldiers entered a plantation in Burke County, Georgia. What they found inside was never meant to be seen. 23 children, locked underground, no light, no proper air, ages ranging from toddlers to early teenagers. But that wasn't what disturbed the soldiers most. It was how similar they all looked. Same pale green eyes, same sharp cheekbones, same reddish hair with faint gold streaks, as if they weren't just a group of children but copies of something or someone. When one of the soldiers tried to speak to them, they didn't respond at first. They just stared, quiet, watching, as if they had been trained not to react. Then finally the oldest girl spoke, 13 years old, weak but completely aware, and what she said stayed with those men for the rest of their lives. "She told us we couldn't leave," one soldier later wrote, "because we belonged to her." A pause, then the part that made even hardened soldiers step back. "She said we are her blood." That single statement was enough to change everything, because it meant this wasn't imprisonment, this was something else. Something planned, something controlled, something that had been happening for years, but here's where it gets worse. There are almost no official records of this incident. Military documents mention it once briefly in a letter marked confidential. Local history books never mention the plantation at all. It's as if the entire place was erased, deliberately. And when something disappears that completely, there's usually a reason. To understand what really happened, you have to go back, before the war. Before the children, before the cellar, back to 1847, a winter so cold that people in Burke County would talk about it for decades. That was the year Catherine Thornhill buried her husband, and inherited everything he left behind, which was almost nothing. The Thornhill estate looked impressive from a distance. Large house, wide land, columns, structure, but up close it was falling apart. The soil had been exhausted, years of over-farming had drained it. Cotton yields were dropping. Debt was rising, and creditors were already circling. Her husband had been reckless, poor decisions, gambling, mismanagement. By the time he died, the plantation wasn't just failing, it was collapsing. Catherine was 28, too young to lose everything, too aware to accept it, because going back wasn't an option. Returning to her family in Augusta would mean one thing: failure, dependence, a permanent loss of control, and Catherine Thornhill did not accept losing control. She studied the numbers, the land, the labor, the future, and what she realized was simple. She didn't have enough people to make the plantation profitable, and she didn't have the money to buy more. That was the problem. And once she understood the problem, she began looking for a solution. Not a traditional one, not a safe one, something else. Something no one around her would have even considered. The idea came slowly, not as a sudden moment, but as a series of small realizations. What if labor didn't have to be purchased? What if it could be created? What if, instead of relying on outside supply, she built her own? At first, it was just a thought. Then it became a plan, and once it became a plan, it never left her mind. Because in her eyes, it solved everything. No dependency, no market risk, no uncertainty, just control, total control. That was the moment everything changed. Not when the first child was born, not when the cellar was built. But right there in that quiet room, with account books spread across the table and a single idea taking shape. Because from that point forward, everything Catherine Thornhill did was part of a system that would grow, expand, and eventually become something no one could stop, and no one would survive unchanged. At first, nothing changed on the surface. The fields still looked the same. Work continued. Routine held everything together. If you had visited Thornhill Estate that spring, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. And that was exactly how Catherine wanted it. Because the most effective systems don't announce themselves, they build quietly, step by step. The first phase of her plan wasn't expansion, it was testing. She needed to know one thing before anything else: would it work? Not the land, not the labor, the control, because what she was planning required absolute control. Over people, over outcomes, over life itself. And control is never assumed. It's established carefully. She began with observation, watching the people already on the plantation, not as individuals, but as variables: strength, health, endurance, traits she measured silently. She paid attention to who worked longer, who recovered faster, who followed instructions without resistance. Because in her mind, these weren't people, they were selections. Once she had decided, the next step came quickly. And it happened at night, after the work was done, after the house had gone quiet. When no one would ask questions. That was when she began. There were no announcements, no explanations, just instructions, and on a plantation, instructions were followed, because refusal was not an option. The first time, there were no witnesses, no record of what was said, no account of what was felt, only the result mattered. And to Catherine, that result wasn't emotional, it was measurable. Time passed, weeks, then confirmation. Her plan had moved from theory to reality. And that changed everything, because once something works, it becomes repeatable. And once it becomes repeatable, it becomes a system. That's when the real shift began. Catherine didn't celebrate, she didn't hesitate, she refined. She started keeping records, not journals in the traditional sense. No emotions, no reflections, only data, dates, conditions, outcomes. She wrote in coded language, simple substitutions, words that wouldn't raise suspicion if seen. Children became growth. Selections became stock. To anyone else, it looked like agricultural planning. To her, it was something far more precise. She tracked everything: health, development, physical traits, even temperament, because she wasn't just creating labor, she was shaping it, designing it. And as the months passed, her confidence grew, because the results were consistent, predictable, controlled. That's when the second phase began. Expansion, more selections, more planning, more control. And with each step, the system became harder to stop. But she wasn't the only one noticing changes. There was someone else in the house, watching, trying to understand what didn't make sense. Richard Thornhill, 16 years old enough to question things, young enough to be ignored. At first, his suspicions were small: changes in routine, unusual behavior, things that didn't align, but over time, those small details began to connect. Patterns, repeated movements, late-night activity. Most importantly, inconsistencies, because when something is hidden, it's never perfect. And Richard noticed that. He didn't understand everything, not yet, but he understood enough to feel it. Something was wrong, and the more he paid attention, the clearer it became, until eventually he stopped asking if something was wrong and started asking how bad it really was. That question would change everything. Because once someone starts looking closely, systems like Catherine's begin to crack. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. And Richard was about to see something he was never meant to find. Richard didn't confront her, not at first, because instinct told him something important, whatever was happening, was bigger than a single conversation. So instead he watched, quietly, carefully. He paid attention to movement, to timing, to the way routines shifted at night, because patterns always reveal more than answers, and Catherine had patterns, very precise ones. She never repeated the same action 2 nights in a row, never used the same route through the house, never left anything where it could be found twice. That level of control was not accidental, it was deliberate, which meant she had something to hide. The first real break came late one evening. The house had gone quiet, lights out, doors closed. Richard stayed awake, not moving, not making a sound, waiting. And eventually he heard it. A door, soft, controlled, then footsteps. Measured, he followed. Keeping distance, avoiding the loose boards he already knew about, because this wasn't the first time he had tried, it was just the first time he had gotten this far. The hallway ended near Catherine's study. The door was slightly open. A thin line of light stretched across the floor. Richard stopped, listened. No voices, no movement, just stillness. Slowly he moved closer, careful not to disturb anything, and looked inside. The room was empty, but the desk was. There were papers spread across it, organized. Precise, not abandoned, arranged, as if she had stepped away with the intention of returning. That should have been enough to make him leave, but it was, because curiosity can be stronger than caution. He stepped inside, slowly, closed the door behind him just enough to hide the light, and approached the desk. At first, nothing stood out. Lists, numbers, notes that looked like agricultural planning, crop rotations, soil conditions, yield projections, all of it normal, until he noticed something strange. Repetition. Certain entries appeared again and again, but slightly altered, words that didn't quite fit. Growth cycle, selection stability, output variation. They sounded like farming terms, but the context was wrong, because the numbers attached to them didn't match anything grown in fields. Richard leaned closer, reading more carefully now, and that's when he found it. A second layer, hidden within the writing, simple substitutions, patterns that replaced meaning. At first, it didn't make sense. Then slowly it started to align. Growth didn't mean crops, it meant children. Selection didn't mean seeds, it meant people. Richard stepped back, his heart racing now, because once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Every entry changed, every word revealed something else. Dates became timelines, notes became observations, and the entire document became something horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a record of farming, it was a record of control, of development, of experimentation. He flipped through more pages, faster now, scanning, trying to understand the full scale, and with each page it got worse, because this wasn't recent. This had been happening for years, carefully, quietly, growing. There were diagrams, simple but intentional, structures, rooms, underground spaces. That was when he realized this wasn't just happening in the house. It was happening beneath it. A hidden layer, a place no one would think to look. Richard felt the room close in around him, because now this wasn't suspicion anymore. It was confirmation, and confirmation changes everything. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overthinking it. He was standing in the middle of something real, something controlled, something deliberate, and something that wasn't going to stop on its own. He heard something then, footsteps, close, returning. Richard froze, the papers still in his hands, the truth right in front of him, and no time left to decide what to do with it. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, not rushed, not hesitant, precise, like someone who already knew exactly what they would find inside. Richard didn't move. He couldn't, because movement meant noise, and noise meant exposure. The handle turned. Slowly, deliberately, the door opened. Catherine stepped inside. She didn't look surprised, not even slightly. Her eyes moved to the desk first, then to the papers, and finally to Richard. A pause. Long enough to understand everything, short enough to remain controlled. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, her voice calm, even not angry, not raised, which made it worse. Richard didn't answer. He was still holding the papers, still standing in the middle of something he didn't fully understand but knew he couldn't ignore. "I was looking for something," he said finally. It wasn't a good answer, and they both knew it. Catherine took a step forward, then another, not fast, not threatening. "Just closer. Did you find it?" she asked. Richard hesitated, because the truth would change everything. "Yes," he said. Another pause. Her expression didn't shift, not in any visible way, but something in the room changed, like pressure building. "You've been writing about people," Richard said, careful, measured, choosing each word. "And you've been hiding it." Catherine tilted her head slightly, observing him now, not as a child, but as a variable. "How much do you understand?" she asked. That question mattered, because it wasn't denial, it wasn't defense, it was assessment. Richard swallowed. "Enough," he said, "not everything, but enough." Catherine stepped closer to the desk, reached out, and slowly took the papers from his hands. He didn't resist because something told him that would be a mistake. She placed them back exactly where they had been, aligned, perfect, then looked at him again. "You're not wrong," she said. That was the moment everything shifted, because she didn't deny it. She didn't argue, she confirmed it. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "You've been doing this for years," he said. Her eyes held his. "Yes." No hesitation, no apology, just truth. "Why?" he asked, and this time there was something in his voice, not just fear, not just confusion, something deeper. Catherine didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly to the window, looked out across the land, then spoke. "Because this place was dying," she said. Richard frowned. "That doesn't explain this," he said. "It explains everything," she replied. She turned back toward him. "You see loss," she continued. "I see inefficiency." The word landed hard. "I see systems that don't sustain themselves," she said. "I see dependence," a pause, "and I remove it." Richard shook his head slightly. "That's not what this is," he said. Catherine stepped closer again. Now there was something sharper in her tone. "It is exactly what this is," she said. "You're just not looking at it correctly." He stared at her because what she was saying didn't match reality, at least not the one he understood. "You're using people," he said. Catherine didn't react. "I'm managing resources," she replied. That answer changed something, because now it was clear this wasn't justification, this was belief, complete, unquestioned. "You can't control everything," Richard said. Catherine's expression shifted slightly, not anger, recognition. "Not everything," she said, "but enough." Silence filled the room. Because that was the truth she lived by, not perfection, control, measured, strategic, effective. Richard took a step back, slowly, because now he understood something important. He wasn't having a conversation, he was standing inside a system, and in that system he had already become a problem. "You shouldn't have looked," Catherine said quietly. That was the closest thing to a warning he was going to get. "What are you going to do?" he asked. For the first time, there was tension in his voice. Not hidden, not controlled, real. Catherine watched him carefully, then answered. "That depends on you." The words were simple, but the meaning wasn't, because in that moment the balance shifted. This wasn't about what he had found, it was about what he would do next, and whether he would be allowed to do it. The room didn't feel the same anymore, not because anything had changed physically, but because the truth was no longer hidden. Richard stood still, not frozen, but aware. Because now every word mattered, every movement mattered, and more importantly, every choice mattered. Catherine watched him carefully, not impatient, not aggressive, evaluating. "You think you've discovered something wrong," she said, her tone calm, measured. "But what you've actually done," a pause, "is step into something you don't understand yet." Richard didn't respond immediately, because part of him knew she wasn't entirely wrong. He didn't understand all of it. But what he did understand was enough. "You're hurting people," he said, simple, direct. Catherine didn't react, not emotionally. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the space between them, not forcefully, deliberately. "You're thinking in terms of right and wrong," she said. "That's where you're making a mistake." Richard frowned. "That's not a mistake," he replied. "It's reality." Catherine tilted her head slightly. "No," she said, "it's comfort." That word lingered, because it reframed everything. "Been taught to see things a certain way," she continued, "to avoid discomfort, to avoid difficult truths." Richard shook his head. "That doesn't make this acceptable," he said. Catherine didn't argue, she adjusted. "Tell me something," she said. "If this place fails," a pause, "what happens to everyone here?" Richard didn't answer right away, because he knew the answer. "They lose everything," she continued. "Food, work, stability." Another pause. "Some of them don't survive that." The words were quiet, but deliberate. "And what I've built," she gestured lightly toward the desk, "prevents that." Richard stared at her because what she was saying was structured, logical, and that was the problem. You don't fix one problem by creating another, he said. Catherine nodded slightly. That's exactly what you do, she replied. Silence, because that answer wasn't defensive, it was calculated. All systems require sacrifice, she continued. The difference is a pause. Whether that sacrifice is controlled. Richard felt something shift inside him, because now this wasn't just about what she had done, it was about how she justified it, and that made it more dangerous. You're choosing who pays the cost, he said. Yes, she replied without hesitation. And you think that makes you right, he asked. Catherine's expression didn't change. I think it makes me effective, she said. That was it. That was the line, because now there was no misunderstanding left, no confusion. No possibility that this was anything else. This was intentional, and she believed in it completely. Richard stepped back again, not out of fear, out of clarity, because now he understood something important. This wasn't a mistake he could expose, it was a system he had to stop, and that meant there were only two outcomes. He spoke. I'm going to tell people, he said. The words felt heavier than expected, because once they were said, they couldn't be taken back. Catherine didn't react immediately. She just looked at him, studied him. Then very quietly she said, no, not loudly, not forcefully, just cert. Richard felt it, not as a threat, but as a conclusion. You don't get to decide that, he said. Catherine stepped closer again. Now the distance between them was almost gone. Yes, she said, I do. And in that moment the conversation ended, because this was no longer negotiation, it was control, and control had already shifted. The shift wasn't immediate. That's what made it more dangerous. Catherine didn't raise her voice, didn't call for help, didn't force anything in that moment. Instead, she stepped back, creating space, not surrendering it, controlling it. You're tired, she said. The tone had changed, softer, almost reasonable. You've been thinking too much, she continued. Looking for things that aren't there. Richard didn't respond, because now he recognized what she was doing. She wasn't arguing, she was reframing. Trying to shift the narrative back into something manageable. You should get some rest, she said, and for a moment it almost sounded normal, almost, but the problem was nothing about this was normal anymore. I'm not staying here, Richard said, clear, direct. Catherine nodded slightly, as if she expected that answer. I didn't say you were, she replied. That was the first warning, because the words didn't match the tone. Richard moved toward the door, not quickly, not aggressively, but with intent. He reached for the handle, turned it, and stopped. It didn't move, locked. He tried again, nothing. Slowly he turned back. Catherine was watching him, calm. You locked it, he said, not a question, a statement. Yes, she replied. Silence filled the room, because now everything was clear. This wasn't conversation anymore. This was containment. You don't understand the position you're in, she said. Richard stepped away from the door. You're not going to keep me here, he said. Catherine didn't react to the words. She adjusted to them. I already am, she replied. That landed, not as a threat, as fact. Richard's breathing shifted slightly, not panic, but awareness, because now he wasn't dealing with possibility, he was dealing with reality. You can't do this, he said. Catherine tilted her head slightly. I can, she replied, and I will, a pause, because now you're part of it. That changed everything. Richard shook his head. No, he said, I'm not. Catherine stepped closer again. You've seen too much, she said, and that means you don't get to leave. There it was, not hidden, not softened, clear, final. Richard moved again, looking for another way out. Window too small, too narrow, no exit. The room had become something else, not a space, a boundary. You don't have to fight this, Catherine said, her voice steady, controlled. You can understand it. That was the shift, from control to conversion. She wasn't just trying to contain him. She was trying to change him. You think I'm going to accept this? Richard said. Catherine didn't answer immediately, then quietly, yes. The certainty in her voice was what made it dangerous because she believed it completely. Richard stepped back again, and that's when he noticed something. The floor, a faint line, barely visible, running across the wood, not natural, not part of the structure, something else. His eyes followed it, to the center of the room. Catherine noticed. Of course she did. "You're observant," she said, not as praise, as confirmation. Richard looked at her. "What is that?" he asked. Catherine didn't answer directly. Instead, she stepped toward the center of the room, placed her foot over the line, and applied pressure. There was a sound, soft, controlled, a shift beneath the floor, and then it opened. The wood separated cleanly, revealing darkness beneath it. A hidden entrance. Richard didn't move, couldn't, because now the truth had a location, a physical place. And that made it real in a way nothing else had. Catherine looked down into it, then back at him. "You wanted to understand," she said, a pause. "Now you can." Richard felt something tighten in his chest, because this was the point of no return. Whatever was below would change everything, and Catherine already knew that. The opening in the floor didn't look large, not from above, just a clean split in the wood, a dark space beneath it. But the moment it opened, everything changed. The air shifted first. Cooler, heavier, carrying something that didn't belong in the house above. Richard felt it immediately, not just physically, instinctively, like stepping into a place that wasn't meant to be seen. He didn't move closer, not yet, because part of him already understood whatever was down there was real, and once he saw it, there would be no going back. Catherine stepped aside slightly, creating a clear path, not forcing him, allowing him. "You wanted the truth," she said, her voice calm, even now. "Now you can see it." Richard looked at her, searching for something, doubt, hesitation, anything. There was none. That made it worse, because this wasn't something she was hiding anymore. This was something she was showing, deliberately. Richard moved forward, slowly, each step measured, controlled, until he reached the edge and looked down. At first he saw nothing, just darkness, depth, unknown space. Then his eyes adjusted. Shapes began to form, structure, not natural, built. The staircase was narrow, wooden, worn from repeated use. That detail mattered because it meant one thing: this wasn't new. This had been used many times for a long time. Richard hesitated just for a second, then stepped down. The first step creaked slightly. The sound carried, echoing into the space below, and for a moment everything felt still. Listening, waiting, he continued, one step, then another, each one pulling him further away from the world he understood, and deeper into something else. The air grew colder, thicker, harder to ignore, and then he reached the bottom. The space opened wider than expected, not large but deliberate, structured, walls reinforced with timber, floor packed down, everything arranged with purpose. And then he saw them, children, at first just outlines, shapes in the dim light, then details, small figures, sitting, standing, watching, too quiet, too still. Richard's breath caught, because this wasn't something he had imagined, this wasn't theory, this was real. There were more of them than he expected. Not one, not two, dozens, different ages, different sizes, but something about them felt the same, their posture, their stillness, their eyes. They weren't reacting like children, they weren't crying, they weren't speaking, they were watching, all of them watching him, as if he was the unfamiliar one. Richard took a step forward, slowly. "Are you?" he started, but stopped, because he didn't know what to ask, didn't know how to ask it. One of the older children stood. Not quickly, not nervously, deliberately, she stepped forward and looked directly at him. No fear, no confusion, just awareness. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Richard stared at her because even that felt wrong, not the words, the delivery, too controlled, too precise. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, then simply, "Since I was brought here." That didn't help. It wasn't meant to. Richard looked around again. At the others, at the space, at the reality of what he was standing inside, and then he understood something. This wasn't just confinement. This was conditioning. They weren't just being kept here. They were being shaped. taught, controlled, and suddenly everything in Catherine's journal made sense. The records, the observations, the patterns. This wasn't random, it was systematic, designed, and that made it worse. Because systems like this don't stop on their own, they grow. Richard turned slowly. Looked back up toward the opening. Catherine was still there, standing above, watching like she had already seen this moment happen and accepted it. "You see it now," she said, not asking, confirming. Richard didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. Only one question remained, and it wasn't about what this was. It was about what came next. For a moment, nothing moved, not the children, not the air, not even Richard. Because once you see something like that, your mind doesn't react immediately. It slows down, trying to catch up, trying to understand something it was never prepared to process. Richard stood there between two worlds, above him the life he knew, below the truth he couldn't ignore, and behind it all Catherine, waiting, not rushing him, because she already knew something he was just beginning to realize. There was no easy way out of this. Richard stepped back slowly, not out of fear, out of clarity. Because now he understood the scale. This wasn't one decision, it wasn't one mistake. It was years of planning, years of control, years of building something no one had questioned. "You can't keep this hidden," he said, his voice steadier now, not loud but certain. Catherine didn't move, didn't react. "You still think this is about hiding," she said. "It's not." Richard frowned. "Then what is it?" he asked. Catherine stepped closer to the opening. "It's about survival," she said, that word again. "Controlled, intentional." "You built this," Richard said. "Yes." "You decided all of this." "Yes." "And you think that makes it right?" Catherine looked at him. "No," she said, a pause. "I think it makes it necessary." That was the final divide, not right, not wrong, necessary, and once someone believes that there's nothing left to argue. Richard looked back at the children, at their stillness, their silence, their awareness, and something inside him shifted. Because now this wasn't about understanding Catherine, it was about stopping her. He turned, fast, moved toward the stairs, climbed, not hesitating, not looking back, because action was the only thing left. Catherine didn't stop him, didn't reach for him, didn't call out. She watched because she knew something else. What came next wouldn't be simple. Richard reached the top, pulled himself out, turned immediately looking for anything he could use. The room felt different now, smaller. Because the truth had changed it. He moved quickly, opened drawers, looked for tools, anything, because this wasn't a situation that could be solved quietly, and then he found it. A lantern, oil-filled, ready, that was enough. He grabbed it, turned back toward the opening. Catherine was already moving, not toward him, toward the desk, toward the journals, protecting the system. That told him everything he needed to know. "Step away," he said, his voice sharper now, not asking. Catherine didn't listen. She gathered the papers, carefully, still controlled. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. Richard stepped closer. "I understand enough," he replied, and then he made the decision. He threw the lantern, not wildly, precisely. It shattered against the wood, oil spread instantly, and then fire. It caught faster than expected. Dry wood, old structure, everything ignited. Flames climbed the walls, spread across the floor. The room filled with heat, light, movement. Catherine stepped back. For the first time, her control broke, not completely, but enough. "You're destroying everything," she said. Richard didn't answer because that was the point. He moved to the opening, lowered himself down again. The children looked up. This time their expressions had changed, not fear, awareness. "Come with me," he said, simple, direct. For a moment no one moved because they had never been given a choice before. Then the same girl stepped forward. The one who had spoken earlier. She looked at him. And then she nodded. That was enough. The others followed, slowly at first, then faster up the stairs, out of the space, out of the system. By the time they reached the main floor, the fire had grown, walls burning, smoke rising. The house was collapsing. Catherine stood near the center, surrounded by everything she had built, everything she had controlled, everything she believed in. And for the first time, she didn't move. Richard looked at her. "You can still leave," he said, a final chance. Catherine didn't respond. She just looked at him and then back at the fire, because in her mind this wasn't destruction, it was failure, and failure was something she never accepted. Richard didn't wait. He led the children out, into open air, away from the house, away from everything. By morning there was nothing left. The Thornhill estate was gone, reduced to ash, and with it the system, or at least that's what people believed. The official story was simple: a fire, an accident, nothing more. Because no one wanted to explain what had really been there. No one wanted to say it out loud. And some truths stay buried, not because they disappear, but because people choose not to see them again. Years later, the land was rebuilt. New structures, new families, no sign of what had happened before, but sometimes stories don't vanish. They change form, they become whispers, fragments, questions without answers, and one question remained long after everything else had faded. What happens when someone learns how to control people without ever learning how to care about them? Because if something like that existed once, it can exist again. Quiet, hidden, waiting, just like before.